Mom, you're too old for that crowd. Kalen said it without flinching, his tone calm but deliberate. The words landed before I'd even taken my second sip of coffee. Heavy and sour in the air between us, Leora sat beside him, her heels having clicked in perfect rhythm with his steps when they'd walked into the small cafe near the harbor just minutes earlier. Her smile now felt more rehearsed than warm. I had arrived first, claiming a corner table with a view of the docks. When they came in, I expected only my son, not her shadowing him so closely. Kalen ordered for both of them before settling across from me. We'd barely waded through small talk weather, the fishing season, the town's holiday lights when he dropped the line like an anchor. Leora wants the ceremony to be refined, he added, glancing at her. She leaned in, her voice soft but cutting. We're just aiming for a certain image. I didn't speak. I simply took a slow sip of my coffee, though it had cooled to a dull bitterness. My mind was strangely still, like a lake before a storm. No anger, just a hollow ache that spread through my chest. Folding my napkin with care, I placed it beside my cup and stood. I see, I said, and turned toward the door. The winter air outside bit at my cheeks, but its sting felt almost welcome. I walked home unhurried, letting each step settle into my bones. Later that night, in the quiet of my bedroom, my gaze rested on the cedar box atop my dresser. Bram's box. I hadn't opened it in years, but seeing it now stirred something in me, an echo from a time when family meant more than appearances. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Some things demanded the right moment, and I knew mine hadn't come. 2 days later, an email from Aunt Persida popped into my inbox. Do you need a ride to the wedding? I can book a hotel nearby so we can go together. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed, I'm not going, deleted it, rewrote it, deleted it again. Finally, I settled on, I won't be attending. It's better this way. It didn't take 5 minutes for my phone to ring. Persida's voice came sharp, cutting through the static. Better for who? Marenza. Certainly not for you. She wanted the full story. But I gave her only fragments enough to make her huff in disapproval. Not enough to start a crusade. You're making a mistake, she said finally. I didn't answer. That evening, while sipping tea in the living room, I opened my laptop. A headline from the local lifestyle blog caught my eye. Inside the Wedding of the Year guest list revealed. My stomach tightened as I clicked through the slideshow. There were names I'd never heard: stylists, magazine editors, high-end florists, photographs of Leora beaming next to social media personalities with hundreds of thousands of followers. Each caption dripped with the kind of exclusivity she craved. Hand-picked guests for an intimate, refined celebration. I scrolled to the full list, reading each name carefully. Mine was not there. Neither was Persida's. None of Bram's old friends who had known Kalen since he was a boy. The Quillen name appeared only once next to Kalen's own. The room felt colder. Though the fire was still burning low in the hearth, I closed the laptop, setting it on the coffee table as though it might burn me if I kept holding it. It wasn't just exclusion. It was erasure, the kind that left no trace you'd ever been part of the story. That night, sleep came late. When it did, it was restless, filled with images of strangers raising glasses in a room I would never step into, and Kalen standing among them, smiling like he belonged. By morning, I knew the ache in my chest wasn't going anywhere, and that this wound was only the beginning. The phone rang just after noon, Leora's name lighting up the screen. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear her voice, if only to know what performance she had prepared this time. Marenza, she began, warm and lilting. As though our last meeting had been a misunderstanding, she could smooth away. I just wanted to explain, the wedding isn't just a celebration. Well, it's part of my brand. The photos, the guests, it's all going to be featured. We have to be mindful about optics. She paused, waiting for me to fill the silence. I didn't. It's not personal, she went on, lowering her voice as if confiding a secret. It's just that some people might not fit the aesthetic. It's about creating a certain image. You understand? I murmured something polite. Though my mind had already drifted, I thought of Bram, standing in his workshop, sawdust clinging to his hair. He'd built tables for neighbors who couldn't pay, repaired chairs for the church without ever sending a bill. To him, appearances were nothing compared to the people sitting around those tables. When Leora finally hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet, her words still echoing. Brand, image, they tasted hollow. I found myself wandering to the bookshelf, running my hand along the worn spines until I reached the photo albums. I didn't open them, just let the weight of them rest in my hands. Inside were years of birthdays, graduations, fishing trips, late-night laughter. None of it was curated. None of it was perfect, but it was real. Setting the album back, I realized the gulf between us wasn't about age or style. It was about what we valued and what they were willing to discard to protect their reflection in a camera lens. The fire in my chest was no longer just hurt. It was something steadier, quieter, and far harder to put out. By evening, I understood I would never see that wedding, but I might still have a way to make sure they remembered what they had chosen to forget. The next morning, I pulled one of the old albums from the shelf and carried it to the kitchen table. The coffee steamed beside me as I flipped through the thick pages, each one a door to another time. Near the middle, I found the first photo that caught my breath, Kaylin at 18. Tall and a little unsure in the charcoal suit, I had stayed up all night altering for his prom. He had insisted on paying for the rental, but the jacket sleeves were too long, the trousers too loose. I'd sat by the dim light of the sewing machine, trimming and hemming until it fit him like it had been made for him alone. A few pages later, another image stopped me cold. Kaylin at 10, standing beside me at Bram's funeral. His hand clutched mine so tightly it left little crescents from his nails in my skin. The photo caught his face in profile, eyes fixed on the casket, his jaw set in a way no child should be. 2 moments, 8 years apart, bound together by the simple truth that we had always faced the world side by side. Those days. He hadn't cared about how I looked beside him. He had wanted me there because I was his mother. I traced the edges of the photographs with my fingertips, the gloss worn to a matte where time had softened them. It struck me then, these weren't just pictures. They were proof. Proof that family had once meant everything to him. Proof that no brand could give him what he had already been given. I closed the album gently and slid it back into its place on the shelf. The ache in my chest had settled into something heavier, but also sharper, as if a line had been drawn. That night, I went to bed with the quiet certainty that this wasn't over. There was still a part of our story he had forgotten, and I was beginning to see exactly how to remind him. A week before Christmas, I stopped into a boutique downtown to pick up a scarf for Persida. The place smelled faintly of cedar and perfume, the kind of store where even the air seemed expensive. I was waiting near the back for a clerk to bring out a different color when the door chimed. Leora's voice floated in before I even saw her. She was speaking to a sales associate, each word light and casual, as though discussing the weather. Kaylin's finally ready to cut the small-town roots, she said, laughing softly. The new life we're building can't have clutter from the past. The clerk made an indulgent sound, and the two of them moved toward a display table only a few feet from where I stood. I turned slightly, pretending to browse a row of silk blouses. Leora picked up a jeweled clutch, running her fingers over the beadwork. "You know, it's not that I dislike his family," she continued, "but some histories just don't photograph well." My hand tightened around the hanger I was holding. They weren't talking about extended cousins or distant acquaintances. They were talking about me, about Bram, about every part of our life that hadn't fit into their glossy vision. I kept my face neutral as they passed, her perfume trailing behind. Only when the clerk returned with the scarf did I force my fingers to loosen, folding the fabric into the bag without a word. Outside, the winter air cut sharper than usual. I walked to the car slowly, my pulse steadying with each step. They hadn't just excluded me from the wedding, they were rewriting the story, so I'd never been part of it. By the time I reached home, the decision was no longer forming. It was made. There were some things you could ignore for the sake of peace, and some things you couldn't. And I had just been handed the proof that this was the latter. That night, I went straight to my bedroom, closing the door behind me. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the heater, but my mind was loud with Leora's words. I crossed to the dresser and pulled the cedar box forward. It was small, but solid, the grain worn smooth from years of my hands resting on it. Bram had built it himself in the early years of our marriage, fitting it with a brass lock that still clicked neatly into place. I took the key from my jewelry box and turned it in the lock. The faint scent of cedar rose as the lid opened. Inside lay the things Bram had chosen to keep safe, his old leather wallet, a brass compass engraved with "Find Your Way Home," and a bundle of folded letters tied with twine. Beneath them all was a single envelope. The paper yellowed slightly with time. Kaylin's name was written on it in Bram's strong, steady handwriting. I'd never opened it, never even held it for long. Bram had given it to me before his final surgery, telling me it was for Kaylin when the day comes that he needs reminding. I had always assumed that day would be one of loss or hardship, but now I understood it might come for a different reason, of forgetting, not of events, but of who he was and where he came from. I set the envelope back exactly where it had been, closing the lid gently. My fingers lingered on the smooth wood, and I felt the weight of what it carried, not just paper and ink, but the voice of a man who had built our family's foundation, plank by plank. Locking the box again, I slid it to the back of the dresser. I knew I would give it to Kaylin. The only question was when, and I suspected the answer might be sooner than I'd thought. The next morning, I took the cedar box out once more, not to open it, but to measure its weight in my hands. It felt heavier than it had the night before, as though Bram's words inside were gathering strength for the moment they would be heard. I fetched a roll of plain brown wrapping paper from the closet. No ribbons, no tags, just a simple fold and a strip of tape to hold it shut. I didn't want the gift to announce itself. I wanted it to sit quietly until the moment it was in Kaylin's hands. Sliding it beneath the tree in my living room felt premature. Instead, I placed it on the top shelf of the hall closet, where it would wait until Christmas morning. Every time I passed that door, I felt a small pull in my chest, a reminder that my answer was already written, sealed, and waiting. I told no one, not Persida, not Dane, not the neighbors who had noticed I hadn't mentioned the wedding. If Persida knew, she'd call Kaylin and warn him. This wasn't a move that could survive advance notice. The week before Christmas moved quietly. I went about my days as if nothing had shifted, baking cranberry bread for the food drive, shoveling the front walk after a thin layer of snow, sending cards to old friends. Outwardly, I was the same. Inside, I felt the stillness before a tide turns. On Christmas morning, I would take that box from the closet, carry it into a room full of people who believed they had written me out of the story, and place it in my son's hands. The rest would take care of itself. When the phone rang 2 nights before Christmas, and I saw Kaylin's name, I let it go to voicemail. Whatever he had to say could wait. My part was already decided, and I wasn't about to give him a chance to steer me off course. Christmas morning broke cold and bright, the kind of winter light that made the snow outside look like it had been brushed with glass. I carried the cedar box, still wrapped in plain brown paper, to Kaylin's house. When I stepped inside, the chatter of relatives and the clinking of dishes in the kitchen filled the air. Leora moved among the guests in a shimmering emerald dress. Her laugh pitched perfectly for the room. She glanced at me, offered a polite smile that didn't touch her eyes, and turned away. Kaylin emerged from the hallway, cheeks flushed from the warmth. "Mom," he said, with the kind of cordial tone you'd use for a neighbor. "I wasn't sure you'd come." I smiled faintly and held out the package. "This is for you." He took it with a curious frown, weighing it in his hands before tearing away the paper. The cedar box caught the light, and for a moment, his expression softened. He traced the brass lock with his thumb, then looked up at me. "It's from your father," I said quietly, "for when you needed reminding." He hesitated, then opened the box. The scent of cedar drifted out, carrying with it a hush that seemed to ripple through the room. He set aside the compass and wallet, his fingers closing around the envelope with his name in Bram's handwriting. As he read, the noise in the room thinned to nothing. His shoulders lifted, then dropped, as if the words were pressing on him and lifting him all at once. Leora, standing a few feet away, shifted uncomfortably, her glass of champagne poised but untouched. Kaylin's voice caught when he reached the final line. He folded the letter carefully, returning it to the box as though it might break. The silence lingered for a beat too long. Then he closed the lid and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Something between regret and recognition. I held his gaze, saying nothing. Some messages were meant to land without a single extra word to soften them. Kaylin didn't move for a moment after closing the cedar box. Then, almost abruptly, he stood without a word. He carried it to the mantel, setting it where everyone could see. The conversations in the room began to stir again, but with an undercurrent of unease. Leora's smile had thinned. She was glancing between Kaylin and me like she was trying to measure the damage. Lunch was called not long after. A long table had been set in the dining room, fine china, crystal glasses, silverware placed with precision. My seat, I noticed, was at the far end, away from Kaylin and the center of the celebration. It was the kind of placement that ensured you'd be part of the gathering, but far from the photographs. Kaylin stood behind his chair, scanning the table. "We're switching seats," he said suddenly. He gestured toward the head of the table. "Mom, sit here." The room went still for a beat. Leora let out a short, nervous laugh. "Oh, Kaylin, that's not." But he was already pulling the chair out for me. I took the seat without a word, my hands resting lightly on the tablecloth. The cedar box on the mantel caught the light from the window, its brass lock glinting like an unspoken truth. Throughout the meal, Kaylin kept turning the conversation toward shared memories, Bram teaching him to fish, the first bike ride he took without training wheels, the summer we camped by the lake. He didn't mention the wedding, but the weight of what wasn't said seemed to hang over every story by the time dessert was served. The tension in Leora's jaw was visible even through her fixed smile. She spoke less, her fork tracing idle patterns on her plate. When the plates were cleared, Kaylin walked me to the door. The air between us felt different, warmer, but also heavier with things neither of us had yet named. I stepped out into the cold, the snow crunching under my boots. Knowing that the letter in his pocket would follow him long after the holiday ended, the drive home was quiet, the hum of the tires on the snowy road the only sound. I replayed the day in my mind, not the awkward glances or the strained smiles, but the way Kaylin's hands had held Bram's letter, careful and sure, as if the paper itself was fragile. When I reached the house, I left my coat on and went straight to the living room. The tree lights glowed softly, casting their colors over the photo frames on the mantel. I picked up one of Kaylin at 12, holding up a wooden birdhouse Bram had helped him build. His grin was all teeth and pride, sawdust still clinging to his sweater. I set it back and sat down, letting the warmth from the nearby fire sink into my bones. There was no guarantee that today had changed anything, but I had given him something that couldn't be erased or filtered a piece of himself, written in his father's hand. That would outlast any curated image. Later that week, a small envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a note in Kaylin's handwriting. "Mom, thank you. I didn't know how much I'd forgotten until I read his words. I'm sorry for the way things have been. Can we talk soon?" I read it twice before setting it on the mantel beside the photo. There was no rush to answer. The conversation would come when it was meant to. That evening, as the snow fell heavier outside, I lit a candle for Bram. The flame flickered, steady and bright, and I thought about the compass in the cedar box. Find your way home. Maybe Kaylin was already on that path. Maybe he wasn't. But I had done what I could. The rest was his to walk. I leaned back, listening to the quiet of the house, the scent of cedar still lingering in my mind, and let the peace of the moment settle in.